Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Haley with Haley Stitches, and today I'm going to show you how to make a super easy jelly roll quilt. This quilt is perfect for any extra jelly roll strips you have laying around. You can get this quilt pattern completely free by clicking the link in the description of my video. It's only free for the next week, so grab it while you can. And if you're watching this video a little bit later, you can grab it for a low cost in my shop. So look through your fabric stash, grab any extra jelly roll strips you have, and let's get started. To make this quilt, you'll need 1 5/8 yard of background fabric. I'm going to be using some pre-cut background fabric strips just to save some time. You'll also need 10 jelly roll strips, a cutting mat, a rotary cutter, a long quilting ruler, and matching thread. Everything I'm using in this video will be linked in the description. I'm going to start by cutting my background fabric. So the first thing you always want to do when cutting yardage is to square up the edge. The edges aren't always square, so it's important to get a nice 90-degree angle to start working from. And here is where you would cut your 2.5-inch strips if you're cutting from your background fabric, but I'm going to use the pre-cut strips. So instead, I'm going to start cutting my border strips. So I'm going to cut 2 5.5-inch strips, and I'll cut 3 6.5-inch strips. So my ruler is only 6 inches wide, so I'm going to be using my lines on my mat to help me get that extra 1/2 inch on the end. If you're going to be using your mat for measurement, you want to make sure that you use your ruler against your mat just to make sure that the measurement is accurate, because sometimes the cutting mats don't have accurate measurements. Now I have my border strips cut, and I'm going to set them aside until I'm ready to add the borders. Now it's time to piece the quilt top. So this is a super easy quilt top to piece. All we're going to do is alternate our jelly roll strips and our background fabric strips. So this is a great way to use up any extra jelly roll strips you have laying around, and you can mix and match from different fabric collections, or you could even cut 2.5-inch strips from any yardage you have left over in your fabric stash. So a few things to keep in mind when you're laying out and choosing your fabrics. I just decided to alternate my colors, so I did red, gray, green, white, and then repeated that process. And I also made sure all the directional prints were facing the same direction. And I started with a fabric A and ended with a fabric A jelly roll strip. So this is what it looks like after everything is pieced together, and you can press in whatever direction you want to. I decided to press down, but you can press open if you prefer. And this is what the quilt top looks like after it's all pieced together. So the next step is to trim. So don't get too worried about this. It doesn't have to be super exact. And there's a couple different ways you could do this to make it work, but I'm gonna show you what I think is the easiest way. But we're gonna trim a little bit off of both sides just to make it a little bit smaller to work with and get rid of those selvages. So the way that I think is the easiest to trim this down is to fold it in on itself lengthwise. So you'll fold the quilt top wrong sides together. So the pretty side of the fabric will be facing up towards you and down on your cutting mat. So spend some extra time making sure everything is lined up correctly, because you want to make sure that this cut is nice and square when we trim out the edge. And I'm going to line everything up on my cutting mat, and I'm going to make sure that all of the seams are matching. If you wanted to be extra careful, you could pin, but I don't think that this quilt really calls for that level of precision. And just to double check, I'm using the lines on my ruler to make sure they are parallel with the lines in my jelly roll strips. So I'm going to cut a little bit off of this edge, about 1 inch, and I'm going to cut about 1 inch off the other side too. The pattern calls for this pieced block in the middle to be about 40 inches wide, and my mat here is only 36 inches wide, so I'm just using my finger to kind of mark where that 36-inch mark is, and then I'm going to slide it over and add 4 inches on so I can see where to cut. So you can see my finger at the bottom is kind of holding that mark where the 36 inches was, and because we want it to be 40 inches, I'm just going to count 4 inches from where my finger was to get a rough 40-inch measurement. I don't have any rulers or cutting mats that are 40 inches wide, so I'm really just estimating here. Again, this doesn't have to be super exact. The main thing we're doing here is just making sure the edges are square and we're getting rid of those selvages. And this is what the quilt top looks like so far. It's about 40 inches wide and 38.5 inches long. And now all we have to do is just add our borders. So we're going to pull out those border strips we cut earlier, and we're going to put the 5.5-inch wide strips on the left and right sides. So here I'm just pulling out one of those strips to show you. We're going to sew it on the left side and then we'll do the right side. Now there's a couple ways you can do stashing. You can do it the quote unquote most accurate way, the right way, and I'll just explain that briefly here using this image. So if you want it to be super exact, you'll measure the left side, the middle side, and the right side of your quilt, and then you'll average those measurements, and that will give you the most accurate. What you'll do is trim your strip down to that and pin to make sure that there's no wavy lines or anything like that. But I am going to do it the easy way and just sew it on and trim off the extra. So there, is the way that's going to be the most accurate and the way that's going to be a lot faster and less time consuming. And I recommend doing the accurate way if you're adding several borders, but here we're just adding some thick borders and I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal or make that many waves. So as you can see on the left and right side, I added my side borders, the 5.5 inch strips, and now we have to add borders to the top and the bottom of the quilt. And these borders are longer than the width of our fabric, so we have to piece our border strips together and then cut them to make sure that we have enough to fully border our quilt. So here I'm going to show you two different ways that you could piece these together. The first thing I'm going to do is trim off the selvage of all of the strips. And these are the 3 6.5 inch wide strips we cut at the beginning. So if you want to sew them together end to end, you can do it where the seam is just up and down. So that is the method that I prefer just because it's quicker and easier in my opinion. So we'll just sew this together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then that seam will be up and down. But if you like a more sort of seamless or invisible join, you can do a diagonal join or on the bias join. And what you do is you line up your strips perpendicular, sew on the diagonal, and then you'll get that bias join there. So I know some people prefer that look because it's a little less obvious. I personally don't really care, and I just join them parallel like this. So I'm going to sew all 3 strips together using that method, and then you'll get one super long strip, and you can use the more accurate border piecing method, measure everything, trim it down to accurate size and pin, or you can do the way that I'm going to do and just put the super long strip on the top, sew it, and then trim and repeat for the bottom. And here I've sewn it along the top, and you have this excess on the end, and I'm going to trim that off, and then we'll use the rest of that super long strip to piece the bottom border. So again, we'll just repeat that process, sew it along, and then trim any excess that's left over. So I think this is just the easiest way to do borders, and I'm certainly not a precision quilter, so to me it all quilts out in the end, and this is what the final quilt will look like. If you want the pattern, check out the link in the description of my video. I think this is a great one to highlight fabric and use up any of those extra strips you have laying around. If you want another jelly roll quilt, check out this video. I have a step-by-step tutorial that'll show you how to do it.